If it's Thursday, UK Prime Minister Boris Johnson, his administration riddled with scandal, heeds the call to step down as the U.S. faces leadership challenges of its own in Washington and beyond. The latest political turmoil at home and abroad in just a moment. Plus, the latest from the White House on its mission to bring Brittany Griner home after the WNBA basketball superstar pleads guilty to drug-related charges in a Russian court. The battle to get her back to the U.S. as well as other detainees. And how far will the United States go to help? Later, mass shootings and how America's gun laws can and cannot protect us. Experts weigh in on red flag laws, toxic online culture, and what else needs to be done to keep Americans safe. Welcome to Meet the Press Now. I'm Peter Alexander, in again for Chuck Todd. And democracy is difficult. The last few years in American politics have reminded us that it can also be very fragile. Right now, we're seeing increasing uncertainty, tumult, and disarray at the highest levels of leadership in some of the world's most important democracies, the U.S., Britain, and Israel, too. Earlier today, the United Kingdom Prime Minister Boris Johnson announced that he was stepping down amid mounting pressure from within his own party to resign and mass resignations within his government. Britain's scandal-ridden prime minister said that he planned to remain in power until his successor is chosen.
As we've seen at Westminster, the herd instinct is powerful. When the herd moves, it moves. And my friends, in politics, no one is remotely indispensable. I know that there will be many people who are relieved and perhaps quite a few who will also be disappointed. And I want you to know how sad I am to be giving up the best job in the world. But them's the breaks.
The herd has clearly moved for Johnson, who becomes the third consecutive British Prime Minister to resign. The political turmoil across the pond is happening amid concerns of a growing leadership vacuum right here in the U.S. as well. President Biden faces an electorate that has grown increasingly disillusioned with his leadership and a Democratic Party that's increasingly worried that he is a political liability ahead of the midterms. As new reporting highlights, and as we noted right here yesterday, criticisms of the president from within his own party are now growing louder. At the same time, leaders of the Republican side of the aisle, they're struggling with former President Trump's viability as its de facto leader. And we're now seeing new or growing rifts inside the party from the Capitol to the campaign trail. We're going to dive into those developments in a moment with a Republican congressman who has been fiercely critical of the former president, but also believes that he is going to be hard to stop if he runs in 2024. But first, I'm joined by NBC senior international correspondent, my friend Keir Simmons. He is following all the political turmoil on the ground there in front of 10 Downing Street. And Keir, Boris Johnson, as you know best, he was able to survive a no-confidence vote just a month ago. So what changed?
Well, Peter, it's the nature of politics here in the UK that you may survive a no-confidence vote, but if the vote isn't strong enough, then you are weakened. You are bleeding into the water, if you like. Boris Johnson in number 10 Downing Street behind me there, contemplating that stunning statement that he made. And Peter, I have been walking around this world-famous area, Westminster, the area around the Houses of Parliament. And while officials will say that the business of government is continuing, what's clear is that the business of trying to pick a new leader, that clandestine political intrigue, is well underway. I saw a number of senior members of the government, people who are likely to be candidates to be Prime Minister here at Downing Street, diving into pubs for chats, quiet chats. I saw members of Parliament on phones taking calls from potential candidates. So in a way, what you could say is, and this is the nature of politics, is the spotlight has moved ruthlessly away from Boris Johnson towards who is going to be next. And right now, standing here, we do not know who will be the next Prime Minister of this country.
And Keir, let's talk about what's next in terms of the relationship between the U.S. and the United Kingdom, specifically the alliance right now as it relates to Russia. How will Johnson's departure impact that shared mission?
Well, I was talking to a British diplomat who was very reassuring to say that the relationship is so strong and, if you like, natural, that this will not make a difference. Certainly the British public support for Ukraine is very strong. So this diplomat suggested to me, whoever is the leader, that policy is likely to stay the same. We certainly heard President Biden in a statement today saying that the so-called special relationship between the US and Britain will remain. Of course, it will, but it does underscore, as you suggested in your introduction there, that there are serious issues for a number of democracies here in the UK, in France, where President Macron is now facing political paralysis because of a parliamentary vote there against him. And what does that mean? Well, look, I think we're seeing a split screen here, Peter. Domestic challenges for these leaders versus foreign policy. On the foreign policy front, these democracies are clear. They want to be allied. They are opposed to President Putin. But on the domestic front, things are very difficult, and they are potentially going to get worse because of the headwinds of the economy, inflation, all of the things that politicians there are fixated on. They're fixated on here too. So the concern will be whoever is the new UK leader. Remember, America's closest ally, whoever is the new leader of this country, will be weakened, will not have the same authority from having been elected by the British public. There could be another general election, and all of that is going to be tricky for President Biden as he tries to hold together this alliance of Western and Eastern European countries and the US facing down President Putin.
And of course, Johnson's replacement, as you note, is going to have a full plate when they arrive. Keir Simmons on the ground there for us in London. Keir, thanks for your reporting here. As he just said, the turmoil in Britain's Conservative Party is happening against this backdrop of new divisions inside America's conservative movement and its ongoing embrace of former President Trump. Take Pennsylvania alone. After the Trump-backed candidate there, Doug Mastriano, won the state's Republican nomination for governor, at least 9 former and current GOP state officials have just publicly endorsed his Democratic rival. It comes amid growing fears among the Republican establishment that Mastriano is simply too extreme to win Pennsylvania's governor's race in the fall. He's a fierce supporter of Trump's 2020 election conspiracy theories. He was subpoenaed by the January 6th committee for his role helping to organize demonstrations that day. Then take what's going on in Arizona. The current Republican governor there, Doug Ducey, who is also the head of the National Republican Governors Association and has been a target of former President Trump's ire, he's just broken with Mr. Trump, choosing not to endorse the candidate that Trump has picked to succeed Ducey as governor. Then nationally, the Senate's top Republican Mitch McConnell is trying to steer his party away from Trump-style embraces of those hot-button cultural issues tied to guns and abortion. As party leaders grow concerned that it could hurt them with the suburban voters, they need to win back Congress in the upcoming midterms. Those concerns seem like they were on full display last night in battleground Michigan, the Republican gubernatorial primary debate there, as the 4 leading contenders all professed loyalty to former President Trump. Hours later, one of the candidates on that very debate stage, Ryan Kelly, was arraigned, it happened this morning, in court on federal charges tied to his participation in the January 6th insurrection. Kelly pleaded not guilty. I'm joined now by Republican Congressman from Michigan, Fred Upton. Congressman, we appreciate making time to be with us. I want to talk about your recent trip to Israel in a moment. You were there as their government was collapsing. But first, let me ask your sense of what's going on with your party. What do you make of Republicans going so far as to endorse a Democrat in Pennsylvania's governor's race?
Well, that was news to me when you just reported it, Peter. But here in Michigan, you know, the margin of victory for Biden was 154,000 votes. A state Senate Republican
All right, Governor, I think we lost you for a second. We're going to give you 5 seconds and see if the signal comes back. If not, we'll revisit with you in just a moment.
We have 5 Republican candidates, 4 of which agreed that the election had been stolen. So it doesn't meet what even the state Senate committee investigated and concluded when they were done a number of months ago.
So, Governor, obviously we're having a little teeny problem with your signal, but we want to keep trying to have this conversation. I want to ask you about this gubernatorial race in your state? Because we lost part of what you said. The Trump influence there is still pretty strong. All four of the Republican candidates said they were loyal to him last night. I want to play some of that sound and get your reaction to it. Let's hear that.
President Trump is still my president.
We have this focus on January 6th where there were peaceful protesters and then some who disrupted the process.
My support for President Trump then was strong, and Donald Trump has done amazing things for our country. He has inspired so many people with what our republic truly stands for. And that's a great thing for our nation.
I would take mean tweets today for a safer America. I would take jobs today versus what we have.
Congressman, I think I just briefly appointed you as governor there, which I assume you have no interest in joining that race right now. But I want your reaction to that messaging that we're hearing from Republicans on the ground there. And if you worry that sort of sticking so close to former President Trump ultimately just cedes the race to Gretchen Whitmer.
So here's the deal. The primary in Michigan is August 2nd. It is a very close race between 5 different candidates. Originally, there were 10, and the Secretary of State's office ruled 5 of them off the ballot. So with these 5, 4 of them debated last night. And frankly, whoever gets Trump's endorsement, like we saw in Pennsylvania, like we saw in the Senate race in Ohio and a number of other states, whoever gets Trump's endorsement for the gubernatorial nod on the Republican side is probably going to be the nominee come August 2nd, once the ballots are cast. So that's what the debate is right now. Who can best attract his support to win the primary? And then we'll see if they move more to the middle against Gretchen Whitmer, who is, of course, the current Democratic governor and not challenged in a primary.
So let me ask you, if I can, sir, about your situation. You faced, as you know well, swift and fierce condemnation after your vote following January 6th to impeach the former president, President Trump right now. So after listening to the committee's January 6th hearings, do you feel vindicated in some way? Are you hearing from some of your soon-to-be former colleagues in different language that you may have at the time?
Well, I do. You know, the biggest thing that I regret right now is there were 10 of us, 10 Republicans, that voted to impeach the president based on his behavior and what we saw firsthand happened. What disappoints me the most is that here we are a year and a half later. We're now just getting other Republicans within the former administration to step up to tell what they thought, what they saw happened. And where were they a year and a half ago when 10 of us voted our conscience and decided to cast the vote that we did? They should have helped us, in my view, back in January when we cast that vote.
But, sir, what does it say to you? You may be vindicated in some form, but soon to be out of a job, at least in Congress.
Well, none of the 10 of us regretted our vote that we cast following on that impeachment vote following the January 6th event. For me, I chose not to run our district. Michigan lost a congressional seat. Our district was chopped up into a sandwich a couple different ways and made it really impossible for me to run, even though I love campaigning. Same thing happened to Adam Kinzinger. His district was cut up. We've got a number of primaries still to come. But at the end of the day, none of us would have changed our vote that we cast back in, I guess it was January of last year.
I want to ask you about Israel in 1 second. One last question, though, about the strategy of Republicans now. There's a sense, Mitch McConnell has said, according to NBC News is reporting, that they'd like to try to diffuse the sort of focus on some of these cultural issues like guns and abortion. How much of a risk is that for for Republicans come this fall?
Well, you know, we passed some major gun legislation that the president signed just a few days ago. It was bipartisan in the House, not overwhelmingly bipartisan. I was one that supported it, but it passed with nearly 70 votes in the Senate. We don't have a lot of legislative days left between now and the election. I think.
Oh, fingers crossed.
Your in the balance of this legislative year. So in large part, this will be messaging in terms of where we are, getting ready for the next Congress to step in January.
Congressman, we see you. Your lips aren't moving, but your words are coming through. So I'm going to ask my last question. Hope the shot comes back. It's simply about Israel. You were there very recently. Right now, they're about to have their, 5th election in 3 years. I'm going to be traveling with the president there next week. What is it going to take for that country to have a stable government?
Well, of course, they're going to have their elections on November 1st. Now, I was there last week with a number of other colleagues. It was a bipartisan trip. We met the same day with the current prime minister, the former prime minister, and then the caretaker prime minister, who will be on the ballot, I suspect, or within the coalition when they have that vote November 1st. I'm actually excited about the president's trip to the Middle East. I think there is an opportunity here where we might be able to see the beginning of a lasting peace with some other nations within the region that may have a very happy conclusion at the end of the day. So I'm optimistic, I'm hopeful, and we'll see what happens.
And they thought our politics was complicated. Congressman Fred Upton from Michigan, we appreciate your making time despite some technical challenges to speak to us today. Thank you.
You bet.
And coming up right here, Brittany Griner pleads guilty to drug-related charges in Russian court as calls intensify for the U.S. to secure her freedom. Up next, I'm going to talk to a former ambassador to Russia on what happens next for the superstar. Plus, Mississippi's only abortion clinic shuts its doors as that state's abortion ban goes into effect. We're going to take you there. We're on the ground. We're watching Meet the Press. You are watching Meet the Press now. Welcome back. You're watching Meet the Press now, and we have new developments surrounding efforts to secure the release of the U.S. basketball star Brittany Griner. Griner, who has been detained in Russia since February, pleaded guilty in a Moscow court today to drug-related charges. Her lawyer told reporters outside of that court that they hope for leniency from the Russian government based on the circumstances of the case and on Griner's admission of guilt. She could face up to 10 years in Russian prison. In reaction, the White House's National Security Council said that the U.S. government was continuing its efforts to secure Griner's release. It criticized Russia for wrongfully detaining her under what they called intolerable circumstances. And yesterday, President Biden spoke personally with Griner's wife as the administration faces growing pressure to find a way to bring the WNBA star home. Meanwhile, the Secretary of State, Tony Blinken, he echoed the president's vows, tweeting, U.S. embassy officials again attended Brittany Griner's trial today and delivered to her a letter from President Biden, that coming in response to the letter she wrote him. We will not relent until Brittany, Paul Whelan, and all other wrongfully detained Americans are reunited with their loved ones. We're joined now by Michael McFaul. He served as U.S. ambassador to Russia during the Obama administration. Fortunately for us, he's now an NBC News international affairs analyst. And Ambassador McFaul, I just want your sort of gut take on this. How does Brittany Griner's guilty plea change the way she's likely to be handled in the Russian system? This is sort of a gamble that it will grant her a little bit more mercy and it will allow for the deliberations between any conversations between the two countries to begin in earnest.
That's right, Peter. It's a gamble in two respects. They're trying to get mercy, as you just rightfully said, and they're also trying to speed up the process. She won't be released in any kind of a swap until she is sentenced. This speeds up that process. These trials can go on for very long in the Russian system. So I think her lawyers made a decision. This is a way to speed it up and hopefully, for her case, and for others, perhaps, to get to that place where there might be some kind of swap.
It seems like such a challenge. You can only imagine for her how challenging it would have been to use those words when, on one hand, they're saying this is totally an illegal trial, and on the other hand, you're admitting guilt. But I recognize that this is perhaps the best way for her to be freed. What leverage does the U.S. have when it comes to bringing her and those other American detainees home?
Well, tragically, the only leverage they have is Russians that we have in detention, and one in particular. His name is Victor Bout. He is a real criminal, not like Brittany, not like Paul Whelan, not like Mark Fogel, who, by the way, is another American who was sentenced to 14 years in prison for bringing in prescription marijuana. All of those Americans are not criminals. In my view, they're wrongfully detained. Victor Bout is a real criminal, sentenced for 25 years, arrested back in 2008 in Thailand, extradited here. And the Russians want him out. I think he's probably connected in intelligence circles, given what the kind of work he did before. And Vladimir Putin, a former intelligence officer, wants to release one of his own, and I think that might be the only way to get Brittany Griner out as soon as possible.
So, Ambassador McFaul, let's put you on the spot. If you were advising the president, would you recommend that he allow that trade?
I would. Again, I don't want to second guess people in the government making really hard choices. But I was in the government when we made a spy swap back in 2010. I worked at the White House for President Obama. We arrested a dozen Russians who were living here illegally. You may remember the Americans were made, a movie series was made after them after they were arrested. And we made the very difficult decision, better to get out 4 people from Russia than to hold on to these criminals. And that spy swap, it was a difficult decision, but I think it was the right one. And secondly, the Biden administration's already done this. In exchange for Trevor Reed, they traded Konstantin Yaroshenko, another criminal. I think was the right call then, and I think a future trade would be the right call in the future.
The White House, as you know, Ambassador, their outreach to Griner's wife has angered the families of other Americans being held in Russia. You were mentioning some of the other names. Here's what David Whelan, Paul Whelan's brother, told CNN just this morning.
I think the challenge for us is that when Trevor Reed was released from Russia in April, there was an awful lot of media speculation, and perhaps rightfully so, that the White House had created a perception that a meeting or a call with the president was going to be definitive for your case being a priority, your family, your loved one's case being a priority. And so I think it has made it difficult for the families to know what we're supposed to be doing to ensure that our cases are being handled as a priority.
So, Ambassador McFaul, how do you address those concerns? Should the president just invite all those families to the White House? Should he just have a conversation face-to-face with each of them?
Well, thankfully, there aren't a lot of them, at least in Russia, although there are all over the world. That's another issue when you create expectations for others that are in jail. But secondly, I actually hope this is an opportunity for Paul Whelan, not something detrimental. The attention to the Brittany Griner case has made the possibility of a trade seem more likely. At least we're all speculating about it. So why not do 3 for 1? Whelan, Fogel, and Griner for a real criminal, Victor Bout. That, if I were working for the president, that would be what I would be trying to push for. And so hopefully this is good news for Paul Whelan, not bad news.
I think there are a lot of Americans who are hoping for something not too dissimilar to that. As you know, the war in Ukraine began remarkably 19 weeks ago today. Do you fear that Americans and the rest of the West have sort of grown complacent about the atrocities taking place there? For a while, it led all newscasts. It was the major headline across every newspaper in this country. And now for many of Americans, it's fallen by the wayside.
Well, yes and no. I'm concerned and I'm not concerned. It hasn't fallen by the wayside for the Biden administration. That I know for sure. And actually, if you look at public opinion polling, the Americans are still quite concerned about what's happening in Ukraine. It just has fallen off of the news cycle because, A, there's so much other news, as you know better than I do, Alex, Peter, and 2, it's hard to cover a war when it's long-range artillery bombing back and forth, right? And so it's harder to bring that to the American people. But make no mistake, the war is raging on. Dozens, sometimes hundreds of Ukrainians are dying every day, and they'll continue to die until we help the Ukrainians stop Putin's army from marching forward in Ukraine. And tragically, they're still marching forward, and that means we have to do more to stop that war in Ukraine.
Yeah, I think you're exactly right. And as you note, it's incumbent upon all of us who do this for a living, members of the media, the news media, that we continue to draw attention to that. And certainly we have people on the ground there who are trying to do that even as we speak in harm's way. Ambassador Mike McFaul, we appreciate your time. Thanks for being with us.
Thanks for having me.
Up next, the Women's Health Clinic at the center of the Supreme Court fight over abortion closes indefinitely. New reporting from on the ground in one of the most affected communities in the country right after the break. You're watching Meet the Press now. Welcome back. Nearly 2 weeks after the Supreme Court overturned Roe v. Wade, the Mississippi abortion clinic at the center of that case is now closed. The Jackson Women's Health Organization, Mississippi's only abortion clinic, closed its doors as the state's new law banning most abortions takes effect today. Mississippi is one of more than a dozen states where abortions are either banned, soon to be banned, or restricted. NBC's Antonia Hilton is joining us now from Jackson, Mississippi. She's on the ground there and has been following this story. If you can, Antonia, just compare the scene outside the clinic today with what we saw yesterday?
Well, this morning, there were a lot of anti-abortion protesters here, frankly, celebrating. And some of the clinic employees were surprised by this. They thought that yesterday, the last day of actually providing abortion services, would be their final day of protest, of coming out and having their voices heard. But for many people on that side, today is a day of celebration. The Mississippi Attorney General's office just released a statement essentially celebrating that this day marks this change in Mississippi, where abortion is now essentially entirely banned, with the exception of a threat to the life of the mother or in the case of a rape that has been reported to law enforcement. And to give you a sense of how much confusion and needed education there still is on the ground, there were 2 patients who arrived to this clinic today thinking that they still had abortion appointments on the books. They had missed calls weeks ago about cancellations and about the overturning of Roe v. Wade. Take a listen to a conversation that I had with 2 clinic advocates.
Probably half of our patients didn't know Roe v. Wade was about to be overturned.
We had people show up today for appointments. They were trying to get first appointments today.
Well, actually, I believe they had appointments, but they tried to contact everyone, and not everyone they were able to get a hold of. And so they came today for their regularly scheduled appointment.
People had no idea.
There are patients who showed up today, not for checkups, but hoping to get abortion.
They were on the books to get one, and they weren't able to get in touch with them.
They tried to reschedule
and cancel. You know, some people didn't answer their phones.
They describe seeing these 2 women hear the news of the overturning of Roe v. Wade and the fact that they had no appointments on the books now, just stand there in shock and then leave. The owner of this clinic is now going to open up a new clinic in New Mexico, in Las Cruces, New Mexico, which, to give you a sense of scale, is a 16-hour drive from here. And the people who work at this clinic have said, not just recently, but for years, that the women that they've served here come from some of the poorest communities in Mississippi. They have a hard time just driving within the state to make it here to Jackson, and they really are not sure that those patients are going to be able to access abortion in places like New Mexico or Illinois, where the services are still available. And so they are gravely concerned now. Many of them don't know what's next for their own work, but they say it's really the patients who are on their minds as this now all begins today. As of 12 a.m. this morning, it's an entire new legal landscape and healthcare landscape here in Mississippi, Peter.
Antonio, you're struck by that moment when those 2 patients showed up literally with appointments on the books, not even realizing that that moment for them, at least in Mississippi, had passed. You're talking about what happens next. New Mexico, Las Cruces is like 16 hours away. Illinois is a great distance. Where do they go? What is the closest available opportunity for them if they live in a place like Jackson, Mississippi?
Well, what I've heard from advocates is that women will need to reach out to friends, to advocacy groups, and see if they can find out about accessing the abortion pill. But the government here in Mississippi is not going to be doing the work to educate citizens on those options. And so it's going to be sort of groups of volunteers and support organizations that do a lot of that heavy lifting. They will have to call clinics in other states and try to set up appointments. But the challenge, of course, there is that the people operating those clinics already have a population in those states that they have been serving. And so they're bracing for an onslaught. They are trying to bring more people on, get ready for, already a new number, a heightened number of phone calls that they've been getting over the last couple months. And so there's an entire infrastructure challenge around this as well. And so for the poorest women here in the state of Mississippi, finding out how to access those pills or finding a provider who's going to help them is going to be a serious challenge now, Peter. That's the reality.
Yeah, no doubt the challenge of infrastructure and, of course, that challenge of education as well, to tell them what other options are available. Antonia Hilton on the ground for us in Jackson, Mississippi. Antonia, thank you. And coming up next right here, what to expect when former President Trump's White House counsel sits down with the January 6th committee for a taped interview tomorrow. Our panel is going to dig into that and much more. You're watching Meet the Press now. Welcome back. Both parties are facing reckonings ahead of this fall's midterms, questioning what leadership they should turn to. For Democrats, some are wondering if they should stick with President Biden as he faces struggling approval ratings among voters. For Republicans, established lawmakers are questioning if they should actively pull away from the Trump wing of their party in an attempt to appeal to more voters, while Trump allied candidates and voters dig in their heels. We're joined by a great panel right now. Politico congressional reporter Nicholas Wu, political strategist and MSNBC political analyst Juanita Tolliver, and the former chairman of the RNC, Michael Steele, also, fortunately for us, an MSNBC political analyst. Nick, let me get to you. You're sort of looking at two different types of leadership vacuums right now, right? Democrats want to see a more fiery, a more combative president from Joe Biden. Some Republicans right now are trying out a world post-Donald Trump. Clearly not all of them. But what kind of an inflection point are both parties facing here?
Well, what both parties are staring down right now are on the Democrat side. President Biden's approval ratings in the 30s, right? Something that could drag down the rest of the ticket. And on the Republican side, you have revelation after revelation from the January 6th committee, something that some Republicans are fearing could bring Trump down if he were to run for president again. And so you have both parties kind of stuck between a rock and a hard place here. You have the leader of your party, but he's a flawed one.
So let me ask you, Juanita, if I can. Let's start with the Democrats. Michael, stand by. You're coming.
Oh, yeah,
you're coming next. I know you're ready. But so, you know, on the topic of abortion, on guns, frankly, on gas prices right now, I hear it repeatedly from Democrats, even from allies of this president. They're like, we just need to see some outrage. When he was in Cleveland yesterday, they were talking about protecting workers' pensions. No real mention of some of these other issues. The Supreme Court recent rulings that are firing up the party. Is he the right person for this moment?
Well, I first want to recognize what advocates are asking for. They're asking him to fight. They're asking him to swing in this moment, to act as though he understands the repercussions of Roe being overturned, act as though he understands what's happening with these mass violence and mass shootings that we're seeing almost on a weekly basis now. And so fighting every single day to address those things. And honestly, I think fighting in this moment is smart, because right now in these summer months, there are still opportunities for change to come. Now, I assure you, come the fall, there'll be a different tone and tune, but I hope that the White House takes this criticism right now with open ears and openness to do even more than what they've already been doing.
But let me ask you about that quickly, because Joe Biden he came to power as a guy who could bring Americans together. He isn't the sort of typical fighter that Democrats may be looking for. They passed on the Bernie Sanders type, the Elizabeth Warren type. That's why you're hearing J.B. Pritzker and Gavin Newsom right now really pounding their fists.
But that was before the Supreme Court overturned Roe. That was before.
So can he do it?
He can do something now. Like my thing is, don't operate from a posture of fear of the rules or we can't do that. Try anything, try something. And I think that's what advocates are pushing for.
All right, Michael, your side of the aisle for a second right now. We were talking about the state of Pennsylvania, where you saw 9 current and former state officials now endorsing the Democratic candidate for governor in that state. What does that say about the Republican Party? Doug Mastriano, obviously a much more extreme candidate, the one the Democrats, frankly, wanted to face. What does it say about what the future looks like for the party?
Well, it's a difficult future, no doubt. I mean, I saw that moment of those 9 Republicans endorsing the Democrat nominee. And it took me back to 2020, the presidential, when, you know, myself among some other Republicans endorsed Joe Biden. And it's because at the end of the day, we're still very much concerned about this democracy and the kind of leadership that is being groomed and put in a position to lead it. And which is why the words of Liz Cheney are so important in the efforts of the January 6th committee, the work of Adam Kinzinger and other Republicans. So the party is going into this fall in a sort of bifurcated fashion. You've got the one side, the McConnells and the McCarthys that want to push the agenda to win the House, possibly take the Senate, and the goal there is going to be all about, you know, owning the libs. Right. And that's going to be blaming them for the economy and having engagement on culture wars. But then there are other Republicans who are looking at some of these candidates that are going to be in the general elections and going, oh, no way in hell am I voting for that. And that, I think, opens a window for Democrats if they know how to go through the window.
So let me ask you, if I can follow up on that, then, is the calculus for Republicans, these Republicans in particular, if they're pushing Mastriano away, that the Fetterman-Oz race, obviously, which has as big of consequences as anything as it relates to the national political scene right now, that people could split their ticket going down? That you can say, hey, we don't need this guy on the top, but we still want a Republican like a Dr. Oz let's say, to win that?
Yeah, I think in Pennsylvania, I don't know if that's going to be the solution that you're going to see. I think people are going to look at Mastriano and go, no, and they're going to look at Oz and go, nope, because they're cut from the same cloth. And so if you're looking at Oz and Fetterman is someone who's got the kind of connection across party lines. He is really, in many cases, a tri kind of candidate. He's Democrat, Republican, Independent appeal. And he's going to use that, even though he's a little bit sidelined for health reasons. But, you know, he's ahead in the polls.
And Nick, Mitch McConnell, as we've heard, we talked about this a bit earlier on this broadcast. He's been trying to sort of push away from these cultural issues that had been so galvanizing for Republicans in the past. Now the idea of talking about guns and abortion may not do so well for Republicans. They think they inoculated themselves a bit with the bipartisan deal that was just signed a while ago. What type of risk is that in places like Pennsylvania with those suburban voters who the party was so focused on winning back to ignore those issues and try to make it all about the economy?
Yeah, there's a real risk here for Republicans. You do have these suburban voters who might have voted for Trump in 2016, switched to a Democrat in 2020, and were maybe thinking of voting for a Republican again for Congress in 2022. Now that, in theory, to some of these voters, Trump was no longer in the picture. But now that you do bring these sorts of cultural issues back into the picture and you have gas prices, inflation, and the like kind of pushed out, that there is some chance that these voters could go back towards Democrats.
Could I also add, though, that the suburban voters that McConnell is talking about might not even paint or fill in the same picture that he thinks they do. Remember, suburbs have become younger. More people of color are moving to the suburbs, and so that audience that McConnell's trying to appeal to might not even exist anymore, especially over the past 10 years when we've seen demographic shifts in the suburbs.
Let me talk about January 6th committee for a second, if we can. We'll hear from them again on Tuesday, but tomorrow behind closed doors, Pat Cipollone, Michael, you know well, the former White House counsel who I cover day in, day out, there is going to be testifying before the committee under subpoena. This was a big win for this committee, though, because there's another opportunity to corroborate what we heard from Cassidy Hutchinson last week. How significant is his testimony, given all the warnings that we have now heard he provided either to Mark Meadows or perhaps to the president himself to say, basically, you got to cut this out?
Yeah, no, it's a big deal. It's a really big get right now for the committee. I think you've got someone like Cipollone there. The questions right out of the gate are, so when you warned about, we could be in violation of law, exactly what laws did you have in mind? And so there's a whole slew of questions that don't touch on executive privilege that he can answer directly. And I think the evidence that they already have that's probably been somewhat put in front of him moved him to this point right now where it's better for him to talk than that be talked about.
Nick, pull back the curtain for us. You cover Congress, obviously. Publicly, we know the Republican messaging is, hey, this is just a conversation that's about anything but gas, about inflation, about all these other topics that they say Americans care about. Privately, do you hear from any Republicans or from their staff talking about how they think this is having an impact?
There's certainly some concern among Republicans that, yes, that these hearings are having an impact, that this could damage Trump heading into a future presidential run. But at the same time, it's important to remember that there's a segment of the country that has tuned out these hearings to begin with. They have dug in against the findings of this committee and might not be paying attention at all. And so it tries the committee might to get their message out. It could be somewhat of an uphill climb to convince the part of the American public that's not paying attention.
We should note there was one notable figure who was at the White House today as part of the Medal of Freedom presentations by President Biden. Liz Cheney was actually there as they were celebrating lawmakers from the past, John McCain, Alan Simpson among them, with Democrats and Republicans present for that moment. We appreciate you guys all being there. Juanita, nice to have you. Michael, always good to have you here. Nick, good to see you in person. Appreciate it very much. And still ahead right now, tackling America's epidemic of gun violence as the latest mass shooting once again puts red flag laws, mental health, and an online culture of violence right in the spotlight. We're going to talk to two experts on what works and what doesn't in the fight for public safety. You're watching Meet the Press now. Welcome back. Monday's mass shooting in Highland Park, Illinois, has drawn renewed attention to the so-called red flag laws, those state laws that allow authorities with a court order to temporarily seize guns from someone considered a danger to themselves or to others. Officials say that police were called to the suspect's home in 2019 twice due to threats of suicide and violence, but later that year the suspect was still able to successfully obtain a gun license. According to the gun advocacy group Everytown for Gun Safety, 19 states plus the District of Columbia currently have red flag laws. In 13 of those states, parents or a family member can petition the court to remove gun access if they believe that there is a danger. Authorities have yet to give a motive in the Highland Park shooting, but experts there say that the suspect fits what is an emerging pattern. Rather than clear political or ideological motivations, shooters can be inspired by dark online subcultures that glorify violence through photos and video and memes. As one of our next guests told NPR, this visual language is, quote, a way of breaking down a person's natural reluctance to commit violence. It's designed to break a person's brain. And joining me now to discuss it is Alex Newhouse, an expert on extremism who's been studying this emerging online mass shooting culture, and Shannon Frateroli, a professor at Johns Hopkins Bloomberg School of Public Health Center for Gun Violence Solutions. I appreciate both of you being here to talk about this, and it's a topic that I fear too many Americans are learning about the hard way through these awful headlines of mass shootings. And Alex, you called these online communities a sort of mass shooter creation machine. Explain what you mean when you say that and how you believe the profile of a mass shooter is changing.
Yeah, so the thing that I really mean here is that we are at this point with the development of mass shooters and violence throughout the country and throughout the Western world in general, where online communities are focusing around violence for violence's sake, nihilism, chaos for chaos's sake, rather than any sort of clear connection to a politics or a set of ideological principles. And in a lot of cases, these online communities are actually fantasizing about and worshiping and obsessing about past mass shooters. So when I talk about this being a mass shooter creation machine, what I'm talking about is online communities going through in granular detail and looking at past shootings and holding up mass shooters like the Columbine shooters, like the Virginia Tech shooter, like past shooters in the last 5 years as heroes, gods, figures to worship.
This conversation used to fall into sort of simple categories, right? You had the white supremacists, the radical Islamists, the anti-government militants, but now that's changed. It's not so clear cut. Is this, broadly speaking, though, a mental health issue, or is it a radicalization issue?
I think it's some of both, and I would also put in that it's also a social isolation issue. One of the best correlations that we know about that leads to violent extremism, violence in general, and radicalization is a person's feeling of alienation and social isolation. So when a person feels dislocated from the world around them, from their social networks, from their families and friends, that is when they can be primed and vulnerable to having an online community actually replace those sort of more healthy social relationships for them. Mental health, of course, plays a massive role in this as well. People with existing mental illness can be more vulnerable to becoming primed for violent attacks and radicalization as well. This type of violence that we're seeing emerge in greater quantities today, I would argue is still a radicalization issue. It still comes from an extreme set of beliefs that people are immersed in and gradually built up towards. So it is not a simple solution. There are a bunch of different factors at play here, and I would say it's all three of those factors.
Alex, I want to ask you about the entry point to these sort of dark online places in a moment, but Shannon, if I can, to you, explain how these red flag laws work and why Illinois' red flag law did not kick in after police visited the Highland Park shooting suspect's house in 2019. I think a lot of people will think when you call the police and say, my son is threatening to shoot everyone, and they take away his knives, that is raising the red flag.
Yeah, exactly. Well, these red flag laws were put into place to respond to exactly these scenarios. There was a gap, and there is a gap in states without these laws, where if someone is expressing an intent to cause harm, either to themselves or others, law enforcement, people have little tools to respond effectively to those threats. Red flag laws, however, allow for people to go before the court, have a judge decide, look, my son, my mother, my uncle is behaving in this way. They're behaving dangerously. They're threatening to do harm. It's not a good idea for them to have access to guns right now. let's just take a break. Let's issue a red flag order, and they will be temporarily prohibited from purchasing and possessing firearms so we can sort out what's going on and get them to a better place before they commit violence.
But Shannon, is enough being done to help educate, I think, Americans broadly about that, right? For example, when police come to a house, do they say, hey, these are your options. Do you want to do such a thing? Clearly, in this case, as authorities in Illinois have told us, it was the father ultimately that signed on for the application for this young man to be eligible to purchase these 5 guns, even after these fears that they had. But it seems to me that, that there may be some mechanism that's missing there. Or how broad does the reporting mechanism have to be for the laws to be most effective?
There absolutely is something missing here, and that's attention to the implementation process. So laws are only as good as they are when they're implemented, when they're used. And what we see over and over again in these cases is that there was an opportunity to intervene with a red flag law, and it simply wasn't done. Now, what I would say needs to happen is we need to make sure that our frontline professionals who are repeatedly, regularly responding to people in crisis need to be educated, trained, and resourced accordingly so that they can respond to these kinds of threats and incidents with a red flag order and do so in a way that's safe and effective for everybody.
And hopefully there's a way that we can offer a bit of a service through this conversation about what signs parents and family members should be looking for. I want to ask you about that, Shannon, but just to sort of, as a predicate, Alex, kind of what is the entry point to these dark online portals where these young men, and I trust likely some women as well, are being radicalized like this?
So one of the big issues at play here is that the types of content that I'm talking about and the aesthetic communities around them are pretty mainstream at this point. On TikTok, for instance, some of these types of content, the very incomprehensible, incoherent type that is meant to basically assault a person's brain, is, those types of content receives tens of millions of views. So it can be really as simple as someone who is simply curious about the types of things that are being shown in that content, having it flash in front of them as a result of a recommendation from the algorithm. But we do also know that there are certain communities more predisposed to this. So we know, for instance, that alternate reality games, which is a term for a type of collaborative community puzzle, essentially, there are certain communities built around those that have more of a predisposition to getting at or moving towards this type of nihilism, this type of reality bending rejection of modernity and society. So one of the main warning signs I talked with parents and instructors about is if a person is suddenly rejecting sort of normal, healthy social relationships and spending more and more time online. That is one of the core ones we see. And you can't help but think that during the pandemic, when there was so much social isolation broadly, that only sort of amplified this problem in this country. Shannon, to you, for those parents who are listening, family members, what are the signs that they should be looking for in their own homes?
I've reviewed at this point, more than 1,000 petitions for red flag orders. And what I see over and over again is very clear threats that someone is intending to do harm. So to parents, to families, to loved ones, if you know someone who is saying they are going to harm themselves, they're going to harm someone else, listen to them and take action.
Shannon, what more needs to happen right now? You study this. What more can we do immediately? Obviously, there was bipartisan gun legislation passed by Congress. The president's now signed it, add provisions for more money for mental health, grants for states to implement these red flag laws. What more could we do immediately, perhaps at the state level, if Congress doesn't have the capital to move further?
Yes, well, from my perspective, there's a lot of good things in that bipartisan gun bill. One of the things that I'm most excited about is the funding for state and local authorities to implement their red flag laws. Mm-hmm. So making sure that state and localities where these laws exist are paying attention to that funding source, that they're being thoughtful and strategic, that they're looking to jurisdictions where implementation is going well, where they've sort of been the pioneers in learning how to effectively implement these laws is key, and really taking those models and replicating them in jurisdictions where implementation isn't happening as well. we have a tremendous opportunity with this bipartisan gun bill, and states and localities really need to take advantage of the funding that's going to be flowing from Washington, D.C. to implement well.
Shannon Fraterelli is with the Center for Gun Violence Solutions at Johns Hopkins, Alex Newhouse, Center for Terrorism, Extremism, and Counterterrorism at Middlebury. To both of you, we thank you for your time on this conversation. That's going to do it for us this hour. I'm going to be back tomorrow with more Meet the Press Now. NBC News Now continues right now with Hallie Jackson.
Thanks for watching our YouTube channel. Follow today's top stories and breaking news by downloading the NBC News app.